In this video, we take a look at the events that took place in the American state of Indiana. Stacy DeGranchamp was a 17-year-old high school student from Fort Wayne. On August 15, 2002, Stacy attended a party where about 20 people were present. That night, the fun turned into a physical confrontation outside the house. Stacy was taken to the hospital but died of her injuries shortly after arrival. The case became complicated because witnesses were unwilling to testify, and as a result, it took the police 17 years to solve this case. Stacy DeGranchamp attended Fort Wayne High School and dreamed of attending Ball State University to build a career as a computer technologist. Stacy grew up as the only child in her family, and her mom was a single mom. She was confident and beautiful. Stacy's friends described her as a popular middle school student, but that popularity had its drawbacks. Some of the other girls were jealous of her. In the spring of 2002, Stacy met Brandon Muff, a Fort Wayne High School graduate, at a house party. Brandon was in his early 20s at the time, and Stacy was 17. She was attracted to the older guy. In a way, Brandon was a bad boy, and Stacy was head over heels in love with him. Stacy hung out with a group that was involved with Brandon. This group included high school party girls Amanda Richards and Whitney McGee. The group often ended up at the home of 16-year-old Holly Boyd. Holly had a pool at her house, and her father would let the teens swim in it, hang out, and do whatever they wanted. There could have been 30 people in the house, and her father didn't mind. Holly, Whitney, and Amanda were good friends, and they were all friends with Brandon. Stacy, as Brandon's girlfriend, started attending all the parties. But as it turned out, there was friction between Stacy and Holly that started back in middle school. One day, when Stacy was in 8th grade, they all went to Holly's house together. Stacy put her feet in the water, and Holly started laughing at her, splashing her. This was said in front of everyone else, and, of course, everyone laughed. So, Stacy got up and left the pool party. Over time, Stacy and Holly seemed to forget their differences. Some even thought they had become friends. However, Stacy's recent addition to the group had hurt Holly. Sadly, Holly had been dating Brandon even before Stacy started dating him. Brandon and Holly's relationship was in the past, and now they were just friends. But it seems Holly thought she and Brandon would get back together. So, there was friction between Holly and Stacy again. But this time, Stacy wasn't going to leave. Stacy sensed that Holly was becoming more aggressive. It was a conflict of interest. Looking from the outside at the group of friends who were spending time with Stacy, it seemed like she was hanging out with the wrong people. By August 2002, Stacy had come to the same conclusion herself. Holly was spreading negative rumors about Stacy just to create more enemies for her. Meanwhile, Stacy's relationship with Brandon began to crumble. Just weeks before the start of her senior year at Fort Wayne High School, Stacy made a big decision. She broke up with Brandon and stopped seeing him. Stacy was getting ready for college and for what she dreamed of for her future, and it wasn't all with him. She had decided to break up with Brandon and his company, except for one new friend she had met over the summer, Abby Oswald. Abby was a friend of Brandon's, so Stacy met Abby through Brandon. On August 15, 2002, Stacy was with Abby Oswald. They decided to go to the mall, where Abby was going to pick out an outfit for the prom. Later, Abby suggested that Stacy go to a party that was being held at Brandon's house. This is what the place looked like in 2002. This is where Brandon lived with his roommate, Justin. Stacy didn't want to go to the party, but Abby eventually managed to talk her into it. At about 9:30 p.m., Abby and Stacy pulled up to the house. Shortly before 11 p.m., the Fort Wayne Police Department, firefighters, and an ambulance responded to a 911 call on Guthrie Street. Police officers had already gone to that address a few hours earlier. It was a small party with loud music, and neighbors had called because they were annoyed by the young people gathered. The party should have been dispersed, but it was not. Officers from the police department and paramedics arrived a second time and found a young woman in the driveway. She was bleeding from her chest. She was rushed to a trauma center in Fort Wayne for treatment of injuries that proved to be life-threatening. Abby Oswald told detectives what happened. According to her, when she and Stacy pulled up to the house, Brandon and Holly were sitting on the porch together. Stacy saw Holly and asked what she was doing there. Holly and Stacy got into a verbal altercation. Eventually, they started fighting with each other. They pulled each other's hair, punched each other with their fists, kicked each other, and rolled around in the grass. Stacy would get the upper hand on Holly to the point where she kicked her in the head or face. Then, suddenly, it seemed like Stacy was going limp and losing strength. That's when Brandon decided to intervene and pull Stacy away from Holly. Brandon grabbed Stacy by her ankles and dragged her to the trash cans in the yard. Stacy stood up and staggered down the driveway. A few seconds later, she passed out. Brandon almost immediately went over to her, pulled up Stacy's shirt, and noticed that her bra was soaked with blood. That's when they called 911. Holly and Brandon were taken from the scene to the police station. When forensic experts arrived, the crime scene was cordoned off. They began taking pictures and videotaping the scene. Because Stacy was bleeding from her chest, investigators were looking for a weapon. Detectives did not see any sharp objects, knives, or anything similar in the backyard or driveway of the home. After obtaining a search warrant, they entered the house and took several kitchen knives that were on the table. Meanwhile, in the hospital operating room, doctors were trying to save Stacy's life. She had suffered a stab wound to her upper chest. She also had a second stab wound to her abdominal area. Unfortunately, despite the doctors' efforts, they were unable to save Stacy's life. Because the stabbing was intentional, Fort Wayne police launched a homicide investigation. At the station, Holly shared her version of events. Holly stated that she had nothing to do with the injury Stacy had sustained and that they had just had an argument and a fight. Holly said that she did not have a knife. She said that she thought Stacy might have fallen on the glass in the trash can. Detectives also interviewed Brandon. His shirt, stained with Stacy's blood, was seized as an exhibit. Brandon told detectives that the fight needed to stop, so he intervened and grabbed Stacy's ankles. Without realizing how hard he was pulling her, he yanked her. He tried to claim that Stacy's injuries were caused by shards of glass that were in the trash can she had fallen into. But Holly and Brandon's stories didn't match the evidence. Photos were taken of the dumpster at the crime scene, and there was no broken glass. There was no blood in or around the trash cans. It was clear from the coroner's report that the injuries were caused by a knife with a sharp blade. The injuries were described as stab wounds. But at the time, neither the scene nor any of the potential suspects had a knife. Holly and Brandon were released, but the investigation into the fatal incident remained open. On August 19, 2002, Stacy DeGranchamp was committed to the earth. She was buried in the prom clothes she was supposed to be wearing for her prom photo. There was a full house, including Stacy's partying friends, Abby, Whitney, and Amanda. Holly Boyd was absent from the funeral ceremony. However, Brandon showed up there, and all eyes were on him. He had the guts to show up. Rumors spread through Wayne High School that Brandon and his friends had tricked Stacy into attending the party so that Holly could hurt her. This made the detectives wonder if it was a conspiracy to get one of the girls to eliminate the other. After Stacy's death, no one wanted to hang out with Holly. Everyone thought Holly was responsible for what happened to Stacy. But another rumor reached the police. Some people speculated that Whitney was connected to this case. A few days before Stacy's death, Whitney left a message on her answering machine warning Stacy to be careful. A detective came to Whitney's home to question her. He wanted to find out why she had left the message. According to Whitney, her message was not a threat. It was a warning for Stacy to be vigilant since Whitney knew that Holly wanted to pick a fight with her. Whitney wanted Stacy and Holly not to be in the same place at the same time. But if Whitney was trying to prevent Holly and Stacy from meeting, Brandon seemed to have been actively trying to set them on a collision course. Detectives learned from Whitney that on August 15th, Brandon called Holly's home and said, "If you don't come to this party, I will never speak to you again." Now, detectives had to figure out if this was some kind of trap set up by Brandon to get both girls to fight in the house. The fact that Stacy had broken up with Brandon had hurt his ego badly. But was he trying to get even with her? Maybe there was a bit of revenge in the whole affair. Holly's jealousy and Brandon's anger could have been what got Stacy killed. But there was one other person who played a key role in convincing Stacy to go to the party that night: her new friend, Abby Oswald. Abby insisted that Stacy go to the party because Abby was friends with Brandon. The detectives wondered why Abby had brought her friend to the Guthrie Street house, knowing there was a possibility that Holly was there. They suspected Abby was part of a plan to lure Stacy to the party. But when detectives spoke to Abby, she denied any involvement. Abby also said she was the one who tried to stop the fight. Since all paths led to Brandon, detectives called his roommate, Justin. A law enforcement interview with Justin took place on August 26. Justin turned out to be a very important witness. According to Justin's account, he tried to break up Stacy and Holly, but Brandon pushed him aside and said, "No, let them fight." Brandon seemed to enjoy the fight. Justin told detectives that Brandon asked him to tell police that Holly hadn't done anything and that Stacy had just fallen. This made law enforcement very suspicious. It seemed that Brandon had more credible information, but he just didn't turn it over to law enforcement. Either he was afraid, he was trying to impede the investigation, or he was trying to cover for Holly. Brandon was eventually questioned a second time, and it was during this interview that Brandon refused to provide any other information. Brandon informed the detectives that he was not a snitch and that he had not seen Holly with a knife. The detectives were sure that Holly had committed the crime. They thought they could find a few witnesses who were willing to talk and tell the truth about what had happened that night. However, out of all the people who were at the party that night, not one wanted to admit that they had seen anything. Without witnesses and a murder weapon, it was impossible to arrest and charge anyone. Weeks passed, then months, then years, but the case remained unsolved. 17 years passed, and no one was ever punished for Stacy's death. Stacy's case was put on hold, and nothing was done. No one understood why. But Stacy's cousin, Jamie McMillan, wasn't about to give up and accept that the killer was getting away with it. Eventually, Jamie contacted Unsolved Cases Detective Brian Martin. In March 2019, Jamie called Detective Martin and told him that if he could talk to Brandon, Holly, Abby, and Amanda again, he might be able to get some new information and move the investigation forward. "Everyone at that party is older now," Jamie said. "Maybe they've rethought a lot of things in their lives, and maybe some of them will tell the truth." Detective Martin tracked down Abby Oswald first. But just like 17 years ago, Abby said she'd never seen the knife. Then the detective talked to Brandon. Brandon appeared to be remorseful, and it had been weighing on him for 17 years, but he didn't remember seeing Holly with a knife. About a month after talking to Brandon and Abby, the detective was able to locate Holly Boyd in Wisconsin. It took Holly quite a while to open the door, but when she did, the detective introduced himself as Detective Martin from Fort Wayne and said he was working on an unsolved case. Holly turned slightly pale. The detective said he knew it had been a while and asked her if she remembered that party. While talking to Holly, there were a few things that really caught the detective's eye. First of all, Holly kept referring to Stacy as her friend. "We were terrible teenage girls, but she was still my friend, and I would never intentionally stab my friend. I wouldn't do that to her. I would never intentionally raise a knife on her. I didn't expect us to fight," Holly said. Holly then admitted that she had a folding knife at the time and often carried it with her for protection. The detective asked if Holly remembered if she had that knife with her when she fought Stacy. Holly got up and went to the bedroom. When she returned, she had that very knife in her hand. The detective couldn't believe his eyes. He thought it might have been the weapon of a crime that the police hadn't been able to find for 17 years. He then returned to Fort Wayne to begin gathering information on the case. Although test results showed that Stacy's DNA was not on Holly's knife, Detective Martin conducted additional tests on the weapon. Eventually, he showed the knife to the chief pathologist who was investigating the case. Dr. Wagner reviewed the autopsy photos and concluded that the knife was consistent with the stab wound Stacy had suffered. On Wednesday, March 25, 2020, 33-year-old Holly Boyd was arrested. After years of silence from the friends, the main witness finally decided to come forward. Amanda Richards, who was in the car with Holly the night of the party, said Holly had a knife on her that night. "The last thing I remembered was Holly picking up the knife and walking toward the house. We got to the house that night, and before we got there, Holly always had a knife that she carried with her. Well, that night, she took the knife with her, and when we got there, she had me hold it in my purse." Now, police were able to piece together the evidence to get a complete picture of the events that led to Stacy's death. Brandon Muff, a former Fort Wayne High School graduate, played a key role in the rivalry between Stacy and Holly. Brandon was everything that embodies the bad boy archetype. Their relationship marked a significant shift in Stacy's life when she began socializing with Brandon's Circle, a group known for partying. Holly, who had dated Brandon before Stacy, still harbored feelings for him. This misplaced affection, combined with Brandon's manipulative tendencies, further fueled Holly's hatred for Stacy. Brandon enjoyed the attention he received from both girls, often pitting them against each other to fulfill his need for validation of his own importance. The feud between Stacy and Holly peaked on August 15, 2002. On that fateful day, Stacy received an invitation to a party. Although her close friends were concerned about which part of the city the party would be held in, Stacy decided to go. When Stacy arrived, she found Holly and Brandon together, and the encounter added to the already escalating tension. The argument quickly escalated into a fight. When Holly realized she was losing, she used a knife and stabbed Stacy twice. After consulting with Stacy's family, the Allen County Circuit Court offered Holly Boyd a plea bargain. Holly ultimately admitted that she had stabbed Stacy, resulting in her death. Holly stated that Brandon or Abby had nothing to do with what happened. She insisted that she had acted on her own. Jamie McMillan, cousin of Stacy DeGranchamp, spoke in court and shared the grief of losing her and how it had impacted them over the last 19 years. "I didn't know if we would ever see this day. We continued to push harder, and, thank goodness that we had a great detective on the case, and we managed to pick it up and roll with it." It was something that we've waited a long time to hear her say, that she actually truly did it. Her signing the plea deal was the first area where she actually was willing to sign off, stating that she did, in fact, do it. "So now we are here today, finally getting the closure that we needed," McMillan said. On January 14, 2022, Holly was sentenced. The plea deal called for a 25-year sentence, with 5 years suspended and 3 years of adult probation. Given the time Holly had already spent in prison and her good behavior, she could be released as early as 2030.